Join our community and dive into chilling horror tales that will steal your breath away. Subscribe, ring the notification bell, and brace yourself for a journey into the unknown. The auction house was cold, despite the late spring air pressing against its stained glass windows. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light as voices rose and fell around him, bidding wars fought over forgotten relics and crumbling estates. Daniel stood at the back of the room, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, watching as the gavel came down again and again, sealing fates he didn't care about. But then it happened. The auctioneer called out Lot 47, the Maddox estate. Daniel felt his breath hitch, though he couldn't say why. There was something about the name Maddox that stirred something buried deep within him. A memory, or perhaps a feeling he couldn't quite place. The black and white photograph projected onto the screen showed little more than a decrepit mansion, its once grand facade swallowed by ivy and time. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring out into nothingness. The property has been uninhabited for nearly a century. The auctioneer droned, his voice monotone and detached. Sold as no warranties or guarantees. No one else bid. Daniel raised his hand before he even realized what he was doing. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him briefly before losing interest just as quickly. He won the estate, for a fraction of its worth, though later he would wonder if it had been worth anything at all. When Daniel arrived at the Maddox estate 3 days later, the air smelled of damp earth and decay. The driveway was overgrown with weeds choking the gravel path that led to the mansion's front steps. As he stepped out of his car, the silence hit him first, not the peaceful kind, but a heavy oppressive quiet that seemed to press against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He approached the house cautiously, each step creaking underfoot as though the ground itself resented his presence. The front door hung slightly ajar, rusted hinges groaning as he pushed it open wider. Inside, the air was thick with dust motes swirling in beams of sunlight that pierced through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The furniture was covered and yellowed, sheets and ghostly shapes looming in the shadows. Daniel moved through the room slowly, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. It wasn't until he reached the study that he found the first clue. A ledger lay open on the desk, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost obsessive in its uniformity. Dates, names, amounts. Columns filled with transactions that made no sense. Payments rendered to individuals whose names were crossed out, ink-smeared as though someone had tried to erase them entirely. At the bottom of one page, a single phrase caught his eye, scrawled in shaky letters. "Unlike the rest, they know what we did." Daniel stared at the words, his heart pounding in his ears. Who were they? And what had been done? Before he could think further, a sound broke the silence. Faint at first, like fabric brushing against wood. Then louder, sharper, until it became unmistakable footsteps moving deliberately above him on the second floor. His stomach tightened, instinct screaming at him to leave, but curiosity rooted him to the spot. Slowly he climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath his weight. The hallway upstairs stretched endlessly, doors lining either side, their surfaces warped and cracked with age. One door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out into the dim light. As he approached, the footsteps stopped. Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Then with a deep breath he pushed the door open. The room was empty save for a single object resting on the floor in the center of the space. A mirror cracked and tarnished, its surface fogged as though it hadn't been touched in years. But as Daniel stepped closer, he saw something reflected in the glass. Not his own face, but a pair of eyes wide and terrified staring back at him from somewhere beyond. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the floor. When he looked up again, the mirror was empty, its surface clear and unbroken. But the eyes remained etched in his mind, refusing to fade. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become slippery and unreliable. Daniel sat in the study, poring over the ledger, trying to make sense of the cryptic entries. Names jumped out at him, some familiar, others alien. Among them, he noticed a pattern of certain names repeated again and again, always followed by dates decades apart. Then he found it. His own name scrawled in faded ink beside a date nearly 100 years old. His blood ran cold, This couldn't be possible. The sound of whispers pulled him from his thoughts, soft and insistent, drifting through the walls like smoke. They spoke in fragments, overlapping voices that seemed to echo from another time. You shouldn't have. Come. It's your turn now. Daniel clutched the ledger tighter, his knuckles white as he strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, forming a single voice, layered and distorted, yet eerily familiar. Welcome home, Daniel. He froze, recognizing the tone, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it before. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside him, resonating in his bones like a tuning fork struck too hard. And then the lights went out, plunging the house into darkness. In the sudden silence, Daniel heard something new, breathing slow and deliberate behind him. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. Its face was obscured and cloaked in shadow, but its presence radiated malice so potent it made the air taste bitter. You've inherited more than you bargained for, the figure said, its voice layered with countless others, grating Daniel's sanity. Before he could respond, the figure lunged, dissolving into smoke that surged forward, engulfing him. Pain exploded in his chest, sharp and searing, as images flooded his mind. Memories not his own, yet somehow intimately familiar. He saw flashes of faces, men, women, children, their expressions twisted with terror, pleading for mercy. And then he saw himself standing among them, holding a knife dripping with blood. Daniel gasped, stumbling backward, tears streaming down his face as the vision faded, leaving him trembling on the floor. The figure reformed several feet away, watching him with an expression of cruel satisfaction. You already know the truth, it whispered softly. Now you must decide what to do with it. And with that, it vanished, leaving Daniel alone in the darkness, the weight of the past settling over him like a shroud. The darkness pressed in on Daniel like a living thing, its weight suffocating and unrelenting. He sat frozen on the study floor, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the remnants of the vision clawed at the edges of his mind. The faces he had seen, the terror in their eyes, the knife dripping with blood. It felt real, visceral, as though it had happened to him. Yet he knew it hadn't. Not directly, anyway. But if not him, then who? The whispers returned, softer now, almost soothing, weaving themselves into the silence like threads stitching together fragments of a forgotten past. They spoke his name over and over, each syllable laced with longing and sorrow. Daniel. He clenched his fists, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, filling the room until it seemed to echo inside his skull. Then abruptly, it stopped, leaving behind an oppressive stillness that made his skin crawl. Slowly he rose to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The ledger lay where he had dropped it, its pages splayed open like a mouth ready to devour him whole. He stared at it for a long moment before forcing himself to pick it up. The entries blurred before his eyes, the ink bleeding into the paper, as though the words were alive, shifting, rearranging themselves into new patterns. Names, dates, amounts. They all swirled together, forming shapes that looked almost like faces twisted in agony. And then one name stood out clearer than the rest, etched into the page with such force it had torn through the paper. Margaret Maddox. The name sent a jolt through him, though he couldn't say why. It wasn't just the name itself. It was the way it felt heavy and wrong, as though saying it aloud would summon something better left buried. He flipped through the ledger, searching for more mentions of her, and found them scattered throughout the pages, always accompanied by cryptic notes. Payment rendered. Debt forgiven. The bargain struck anew. Each entry was dated decades apart, spanning nearly 2 centuries. Whatever Margaret Maddox had done, or been part of, it had bound her family to something far older and darker than Daniel could comprehend. The house groaned around him, settling into the night as though preparing for sleep. But Daniel knew better. This place didn't sleep. It waited. He moved cautiously through the halls, drawn inexplicably toward the staircase leading to the upper floors. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the warped wood, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top of the stairs, he paused, listening intently for any sign of movement. The whispers had faded, completely replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against his ears like cotton wool. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, faint light spilling out from within. Daniel hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but curiosity rooted him to the spot. Slowly, he approached the door, pushing it open wider and stepping inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, dominated by a large four-poster bed draped in tattered curtains. A vanity sat against one wall, its mirror cracked and fogged much like the one he had seen earlier. But this time there was no reflection waiting for him, only darkness pooling in the glass like liquid obsidian. On the bedside table rested a photograph framed in tarnished silver. Daniel picked it up, studying the image carefully. It showed a woman standing beside the mansion, her expression unreadable yet hauntingly familiar. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, her dress simple yet elegant. Beneath her stern gaze, Daniel noticed something strange, a faint shadow clinging to her, shoulder-shaped almost like a child's hand gripping tightly. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was Margaret Maddox, and whatever she had done, it involved children. Before he could process further, the air shifted, growing colder until his breath misted in front of him. The whispers erupted again, louder this time, overlapping voices speaking. In frantic tones, she took them. They never came back. Find them. Daniel spun around, searching for the source of the voices, but the room was empty, save for the photograph clutched tightly in his hand. He stared at it again, focusing on the shadowy figure clinging to Margaret's shoulder. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real, and then it moved. The shadow detached itself from the photograph, writhing and twisting in midair before solidifying into the shape of a small child. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a veil of darkness, but its presence radiated grief so profound, it brought tears to Daniel's eyes. "You have to help us," the child whispered, its voice barely audible over the pounding in Daniel's ears. "We've been waiting for so long." "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "We're hers," the child replied softly. "And we're yours?" Before Daniel could respond, the figure dissolved into smoke, seeping into the cracks in the walls until it vanished entirely. The whispers followed, soon after fading into silence once more. When Daniel woke hours later, sunlight streamed through, the boarded-up windows painting the room in golden hues. For a moment he thought it had all been a dream, the whispers, the visions of the child. But when he looked down at his hands, he saw the photograph still clutched tightly in his grip. His stomach churned as he realized something was different. The mansion no longer felt empty. Soft sounds drifted through the halls, distant laughter mingling with faint cries. Footsteps echoed overhead, moving deliberately as though someone, or something, was walking the same paths he had explored the night before. Daniel rose to his feet, clutching the photograph like a lifeline. He needed answers, and he knew where to start. The attic. Ascending the narrow staircase leading to the uppermost level of the house, Daniel felt the temperature drop sharply, frost spreading across the wooden steps beneath his feet. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, tinged with something metallic. Blood. At the top he found a single door locked tight, rust eating away at the hinges. Using the edge of the photograph frame, he pried it open, wincing as the wood splintered beneath his weight. Inside, the attic stretched endlessly, filled with trunks, crates, and boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. As he moved deeper into the space, he noticed something strange. A section of the floorboards had been removed, revealing a hollow cavity beneath. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in yellowed cloth tied with fraying ribbon. Daniel knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he untied the knot. The cloth fell away, revealing a collection of objects: a child's doll missing its head, a music box whose lid refused to open, a pair of tiny shoes worn smooth with use, and at the center of it all, a journal. Its cover was cracked, leather brittle, with age embossed with the initials M.M. Margaret Maddox. Daniel opened it slowly, the pages stiff and resistant beneath his fingers. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost obsessive in its uniformity, mirroring the ledger he had found downstairs. But these entries were personal, raw emotions spilling onto the page like blood from a wound. "I didn't want to do it," the first entry read, "but they left me no choice. The voices promised salvation if I obeyed. So I did. And now they're gone, taken from me forever." Daniel's heart sank as he continued reading each word, cutting deeper than the last. Margaret had made a deal with something ancient, trading innocence for power, wealth, safety, but the price had been higher than she anticipated. "They come to me in dreams," she wrote in a later entry, their faces twisted with rage, their voices accusing. "They say I betrayed them. And maybe I did. But I can't undo what's been done." The final entry stopped him cold. They know about him now, about Daniel. He'll find this place sooner or later, and when he does, he'll have to choose, to break the cycle or continue it. Either way, the debt must be paid. Daniel closed the journal, his hands shaking violently as the truth settled over him like a shroud. This wasn't just Margaret's burden anymore. It was his. Daniel sat amidst the relics of Margaret Maddox's past, the journal resting heavily in his lap. The attic was suffocating now, its air thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic that lingered on the edge of his senses. Blood. His fingers traced the cracked leather cover of the journal as though it might offer answers, but all it gave him was silence. The entries had been clear enough. Margaret Maddox had made a deal, one that cost her dearly. But what haunted Daniel most was the final line. He'll find this place sooner or later, and when he does, he'll have to choose. Choose what? To break the cycle or continue it? The implications churned in his mind like storm clouds rolling across the horizon. Whatever Margaret had done, whatever she had bargained for, it hadn't ended with her. It had passed down through generations, feeding on the family until it reached him. And now, whether he wanted it or not, the debt was his to pay. The attic seemed smaller somehow, its walls closing in as though they were alive and aware of his presence. Daniel rose unsteadily to his feet, clutching the journal tightly. He needed to leave, to get out of this house, but something held him back. A pull, faint yet insistent, tugging at the edges of his consciousness like a thread unraveling slowly. It came from below. The whispers had returned, softer now but unmistakable, drifting up through the floorboards like smoke seeping into cracks. They weren't just voices anymore, they were calling him by name. Daniel. Each syllable dripped with longing and sorrow, wrapping around him like chains. He tried to resist, telling himself it was madness to follow them. But his body betrayed him. Step by step, he descended the narrow staircase leading back into the mansion's upper hallways. The house felt different now, not empty, but alive. Footsteps echoed faintly behind closed doors. Laughter rang out only to dissolve into sobs, and shadows moved independently of their owners, twisting unnaturally along the walls. Daniel moved cautiously, his breath shallow as he followed the whispers deeper into the labyrinthine corridors. They led him to a door he hadn't noticed before, a heavy oak slab reinforced with iron bands, its surface scarred with scratches so deep they looked like claw marks. The handle was cold beneath his palm, frost forming under his touch as he pushed it open. Inside was a child's bedroom, or what remained of one. The furniture was broken, splintered wood scattered across the floor like bones left behind by scavengers. Dolls sat propped against the walls, their porcelain faces cracked and hollow-eyed, staring at him with expressions frozen in silent screams. And then he saw it, the mirror. It hung above an antique dresser, its frame tarnished and warped, the glass fogged as though it hadn't been touched in decades. But unlike the other mirrors he'd encountered, this one wasn't empty. Within its depths, shapes shifted lazily, indistinct forms writhing like smoke trapped inside a jar. As Daniel approached, the figures began to take shape. Children, dozens of them, their faces pale and translucent, their eyes wide with terror. They reached out toward him, their hands pressing against the glass as though begging for release. "You promised us safety," one of them whispered, her voice breaking mid-sentence. "But you lied. I didn't. I'm not her." Daniel stammered, backing away until his spine hit the wall. "But you are," another voice replied, layered over the first. "You carry her blood. You carry her guilt." Before Daniel could respond, the mirror rippled like water, its surface distorting violently. The children vanished, replaced by a single figure standing motionless in the reflection. It was Margaret Maddox. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunk in pits of despair, but there was something else. Anger, raw and unrelenting, burning beneath the surface. She stepped forward, her form dissolving into smoke as she surged out of the mirror and into the room. "No more running," she hissed, her voice layered with countless others, grating against Daniel's ears like nails on slate. "You've inherited my curse. You'll finish what I started." Daniel stumbled backward, clutching the journal like a shield. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" Margaret tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then, without warning, she lunged, her hand plunging straight through his chest. Pain exploded in his ribs, sharp and searing, as images flooded his mind. Flashes of memories that weren't his own, yet somehow intimately familiar. He saw Margaret cutting deals in candlelit rooms, exchanging innocence for power. He saw her, dragging children into the basement, their cries muffled by the thick stone walls. And he saw herself standing over a blood-soaked altar, chanting words in a language older than time itself. When the vision subsided, Daniel found himself collapsed, on the floor gasping for air. Margaret stood over him, her expression unreadable. "The bargain must be renewed," she said softly, her voice tinged with both regret and resolve. "Or broken entirely. Choose wisely." With that, she dissolved into smoke, seeping back into the mirror and leaving Daniel alone in the ruins of the child's bedroom. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become unreliable again. When Daniel finally regained his footing, he realized something crucial. The journal wasn't just a record of Margaret's sins, it was also a map. Hidden within its pages were clues pointing to the location of the altar she had mentioned in the vision, the basement. Descending into the bowels of the house felt like stepping into another world entirely. The air grew colder with each step, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decay. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a dimly lit corridor lined with shelves stacked high with jars and boxes. Dust coated everything, muffling the sound of his footsteps as he moved cautiously forward. At the far end of the corridor stood a door, its surface carved with intricate symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew instinctively that beyond this door lay the truth, the culmination of Margaret's curse and the key to breaking it, but opening it would come at a cost. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and circular, dominated by a stone altar stained black with age. Candles flickered weakly along the walls, their flames casting erratic shadows that danced across the ceiling. On the altar rested a book bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle. Daniel approached cautiously, his hands trembling as he opened it. The text was written in a language he didn't recognize, but the illustrations spoke volumes, diagrams, of rituals involving blood sacrifice, chants invoking entities whose names defied pronunciation, and warnings scrawled in the margins about the consequences of failure. Then he saw it, a section marked with a ribbon tied loosely around the spine. The title read "The Ritual of Severance." Below it, detailed instructions described how to sever the bond between the living and the dead, freeing those trapped in limbo while erasing the curse forever. But there was a catch. The ritual required a confession spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Only then could the debt be paid. Daniel's stomach churned as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about ending the curse, it was about accountability. Someone had to admit what they had done. Someone had to take responsibility, and that someone was him. The weight of the ritual book in Daniel's hands felt heavier than it should have, as though the pages themselves carried the burden of decades, centuries of guilt. He stared at the instructions, his mind racing through the implications. A confession, out loud, in front of witnesses. But who or what would bear witness in this cursed house? He glanced around the basement room, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows that writhed unnaturally along the walls. Every sound, the Drip of water from unseen leaks, the faint creak of wooden beams above him, felt amplified, pressing against his ears like a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. And then there were the whispers. They returned without warning, soft and insistent, weaving themselves into the silence until they became a chorus. Speak the truth. Admit your sins. Break the cycle. Daniel clenched his fists, trying to block them out, but the voices weren't external. They came from within, resonating in his bones like a tuning fork struck too hard. It was as if the house itself had infected him, forcing him to confront not just Margaret's crimes but his own complicity. Because deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just her curse anymore. Summoning every ounce of courage, Daniel began to read aloud, his voice trembling as he recited the incantation written in the book. The words felt foreign on his tongue, guttural and sharp, yet somehow familiar, as though they had been waiting for him all along. Each syllable echoed unnaturally in the small chamber, reverberating off the stone walls and filling the air with an oppressive energy. As he spoke, the symbols carved into the doorframe began to glow, their light pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Shadows writhed across the ceiling, taking on shapes that resembled human figures before dissolving into smoke. The temperature plummeted, frost spreading across the floor beneath his feet. Then suddenly, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, shaking the very foundation of the house. From the darkness emerged figures, dozens of them, their forms translucent and shimmering like heat rising off pavement. Children. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with sorrow, but their expressions radiated anger and betrayal. "You promised us safety," one of them said, stepping forward. Her voice was layered with countless others grating against Daniel's sanity. "But you betrayed us." "I'm not responsible for what happened," Daniel shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "I didn't make the deal. I didn't hurt anyone." "But you're here," another child replied, his tone accusatory. "You carry her blood. You carry her guilt." Before Daniel could respond, the children surged forward, their forms dissolving into smoke that engulfed him completely. Pain exploded in his chest, sharp and searing, as images flooded his mind once again. This time, however, the visions were clearer, more visceral. He saw himself standing beside Margaret Maddox, not as a bystander, but as an active participant. His hands were stained with blood, holding the same knife she had used in the sacrifices. He watched himself dragging children into the basement, their cries muffled by the thick stone walls, and he saw himself chanting alongside her, invoking entities whose names defied pronunciation. "No," Daniel gasped, stumbling backward until his spine hit the altar. "That's not me, it can't be." "It is you," Margaret's voice whispered, emerging from the shadows. She stood several feet away, her expression unreadable. "You think you're innocent because you weren't there when it began, but the curse doesn't care about time or place. It feeds on family lines, on blood." Daniel sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face as the weight of the truth crushed him. He wasn't just the inheritor of Margaret's legacy, he was its continuation. When the visions finally subsided, Daniel found himself lying on the cold stone floor, gasping for air. The children had vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of wildflowers and the echo of their laughter. Margaret remained, watching him with an expression that bordered on pity. "There's still time to fix this," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "Finish the ritual. Admit what you've done or what you represent. Break the cycle." Daniel hesitated, his mind reeling. Could he do it? Could he stand in front of these ghosts, all the victims of Margaret's curse, and confess to crimes he hadn't committed but was nonetheless tied to? Taking a shuddering breath, he rose to his feet, clutching the ritual book tightly. "Fine," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Let's finish this." The final step of the ritual required him to stand at the center of the room, directly in front of the altar, and speak the confession aloud. As he moved into position, the symbols carved into the door frame glowed brighter, their light pulsing in sync with his heartbeat. The air grew colder, frost spreading across the walls like icy veins. Daniel closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of courage he possessed. Then, slowly, deliberately, he began to speak. "I am Daniel Maddox," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally, in the small chamber. "And I carry the guilt of my ancestors. Through their actions and mine, I have caused pain and suffering beyond measure. I offer this confession as proof of my remorse. Release those who are trapped. Break the cycle." For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained silent save for the faint crackle of candle flames. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The symbols erupted into blinding light, flooding the room with an intensity that forced Daniel to shield his eyes. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping voices speaking, in frantic tones. "It's working. They're free." But at what cost? As the light faded, Daniel opened his eyes to find the room transformed. The candles had extinguished themselves, plunging the space into darkness. The symbols carved into the doorframe had vanished entirely, leaving behind smooth, unblemished stone. But something else had changed. Margaret stood before him, her expression softer now, almost peaceful. "You've done it," she said quietly. "The curse is broken. The debt is paid." Before Daniel could respond, she dissolved into smoke, seeping into the cracks in the walls until she vanished entirely. When Daniel stepped back into the main hallway of the mansion, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The air smelled clean for the first time since he'd arrived, carrying none of the decay or metallic tang he had grown accustomed to. Footsteps no longer echoed through empty rooms, and the shadows remained static, clinging to corners like normal darkness. The house was finally silent. But as Daniel prepared to leave, he noticed something strange. The photograph of Margaret Maddox, the one he had found in the attic, was clutched tightly in his hand. Its surface was cracked, the image faded almost entirely. Yet when he turned it over, new writing appeared on the back, scrawled in ink, so fresh it looked wet. "The debt is never truly paid." A chill ran down Daniel's spine as the realization hit him. Breaking the curse hadn't erased it. It had simply passed the burden onto someone else. Somewhere, sometime, another descendant would inherit the legacy of the Maddox family, and when that day came, the cycle would begin anew. The photograph burned in Daniel's hand, its edges curling slightly as though the paper itself recoiled from the words scrawled on the back. He stared at them, his mind struggling to process their meaning. The debt is never truly paid. What did it mean? Hadn't he done everything required? Broken the cycle? Freed the trapped? Souls confessed the sins of his bloodline? But deep down he knew the truth. Some debts couldn't be erased, they could only be passed on like a shadow cast by an unyielding sun. The curse wasn't gone, it had merely shifted, waiting for its next victim. And until that moment came, Daniel was left with the aftermath, a hollow emptiness that gnawed at him relentlessly. Stepping outside into the morning light felt surreal. The mansion loomed behind him, silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. For the first time since he'd arrived, it looked like what it truly was, an abandoned relic of the past, swallowed by ivy and time. Yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, biding its time until the next chapter of its story unfolded. He climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, breaking the oppressive quiet that had settled over the property. As he pulled away, he glanced at the rearview mirror one last time and froze. Reflected in the glass, standing on the mansion's front steps, was Margaret Maddox. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then, slowly, deliberately, she raised a hand and pointed, not at him, but at something beyond him. Something unseen. Before Daniel could react, the reflection vanished, leaving only the empty steps behind. His heart pounded in his chest as he tore his gaze away, focusing instead on the road ahead. But even as the mansion disappeared from view, Swallowed by the dense wood surrounding it, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being followed. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time had become slippery again, but Daniel couldn't settle. Sleep eluded him, plagued by dreams of children reaching out to him from shadows, their voices pleading for help. During the day, he wandered aimlessly through his apartment, unable to focus on anything but the photograph clutched tightly in his hand. Its presence was a constant reminder of the burden he now carried, a weight far heavier than any physical object should have been. And then there were the whispers. They started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a faint murmur in the background when he was alone, easily dismissed as the hum of electricity or the wind brushing against the windows. But soon they grew louder, more insistent, overlapping voices speaking in fragments that formed sentences too disjointed to make sense of. You think you're free? It's not over. Find us. Daniel tried to ignore them, telling himself it was stress or exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But the whispers weren't just external, they came from within, resonating in his bones like a tuning fork struck too hard. It was as if the house had infected him, embedding itself in his very soul. One night, unable to endure the torment any longer, he sat at his kitchen table and spread out the contents of the journal he'd salvaged from the attic. Each page was a labyrinth of guilt and despair, detailing Margaret's descent into madness as she struggled to maintain control over the bargain she'd made. But hidden among the entries were clues, cryptic references to locations and rituals that hinted at something larger, something older than even the Maddox family curse. His eyes landed on a name repeated throughout the text, always accompanied by dates decades apart: Black Hollow. It was mentioned sparingly, often in passing, but each reference carried an undertone of dread. Black Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a nexus, a convergence point where the veil between worlds thinned enough for entities older than time to seep through. According to the journal, it was here that Margaret had struck her deal, sacrificing innocence to secure power and protection for her family. But the final entry stopped him cold. If the cycle is broken, the debt will seek another vessel, find Black Hollow and destroy the altar, or risk unleashing something worse than death. Daniel's stomach churned as the realization hit him. Breaking the curse hadn't ended it. It had merely delayed the inevitable. Whatever entity Margaret had bargained with, it wasn't bound by human notions of time or consequence. It would come for him eventually, seeking payment in full. And unless he acted quickly, others would suffer because of his failure. The journey to Black Hollow took him farther than he'd anticipated, deeper into the wilderness than any map dared to chart. The roads became narrower, winding through dense forests shrouded in perpetual twilight. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, tinged with something metallic: blood. When he finally arrived, the sight before him sent a chill down his spine. Black Hollow was a crater-like depression surrounded by jagged cliffs, its floor littered with stones carved with symbols identical to those he'd seen in the basement ritual room. At the center stood an altar, ancient and weathered, its surface stained, black with age. Candles flickered weakly around it, their flames casting erratic shadows that danced across the ground like living things. As Daniel approached, the whispers returned, louder now, forming a deafening chorus that pressed against his ears like cotton wool. You've come to finish it, or continue it. Choose wisely. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, clutching a shard of obsidian he'd taken from the mansion's basement. The journal had instructed him to destroy the altar using an object tied to the cursed soul, in this case the shard, and recite a chant meant to sever the connection between worlds permanently. But as he raised the obsidian above the altar, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Margaret. This figure was indistinct, shifting, constantly between shapes: a man, a woman, a child, then nothing at all. Its face was featureless, smooth and white like porcelain, yet it radiated an aura of malice so potent it made the air taste bitter. You shouldn't have come here, it hissed, its voice layered with countless others, grating against Daniel's sanity. This isn't your fight. It is now. Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I'm ending this. Without hesitation, he brought the shard down onto the altar, striking it dead center. The glass shattered instantly, shards exploding outward in every direction. A blinding flash of light engulfed the clearing, followed by a deafening crack, like thunder. When the light faded, the altar was gone, replaced by a scorched patch of earth. The whispers ceased entirely, leaving behind an eerie silence that stretched endlessly. But as Daniel turned to leave, he noticed something strange. The shard of obsidian lay at his feet, unbroken, and on its surface, etched into the stone like acid, were 3 words. The debt remains. A chill ran down Daniel's spine as the realization hit him. Destroying the altar hadn't ended the curse, it had merely scattered it, spreading the burden wider and thinner across the world. And now, wherever he went, the debt would follow. The shard of obsidian felt heavier in Daniel's hand than it had before, its surface cold and unyielding despite the heat radiating from the scorched earth beneath his feet. He stared at the etched words. The debt remains, his mind racing, to make sense of what they meant. Hadn't he done everything required? Broken the altar, severed the connection, freed the trapped souls? But deep down he knew the truth. Some debts couldn't be erased. They could only be transformed. The curse wasn't gone. It had fractured, splintered into countless pieces that would embed themselves in others, waiting for new vessels to carry the burden. And Daniel, whether he liked it or not, was still tied to it. As he left Black Hollow, the forest seemed quieter than when he'd arrived, or maybe it was just him. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the packed dirt path, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against his ears like a void. By the time he reached his car, parked, at the edge of the wilderness, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. He climbed inside, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but instead of relief, all he felt was dread, because something was different. In the rearview mirror, reflected faintly against the glass, were 2 figures standing where no one should have been. They were children. One boy, one girl, their faces pale and translucent, their eyes wide with sorrow. They didn't speak, but their presence radiated grief so profound it brought tears to Daniel's eyes, and then they pointed, not at him, but at something beyond, something unseen. Before Daniel could react, the reflection vanished, leaving only the empty road behind. Days passed, or maybe weeks, but Daniel couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows moved independently of their owners, twisting unnaturally along walls and corners. Footsteps echoed faintly behind closed doors. Laughter rang out only to dissolve into sobs. Even in broad daylight, the air felt heavy, suffocating, as though the weight of centuries pressed down on him relentlessly. He tried to distract himself, burying himself in work or mundane tasks, but nothing could silence the questions gnawing at the edges of his mind. What did the shard mean? Why had the debt remained? And most importantly, who would be next? One night, unable to endure the torment any longer, he sat at his kitchen table and spread out the photograph of Margaret Maddox. Its surface was cracked, the image faded almost entirely, but the words scrawled on the back remained clear. The debt is never truly paid. Staring at them, Daniel realized something crucial. This wasn't just about breaking the curse. It was about understanding it, about accepting that some things couldn't be undone, only carried forward. And if that was true, then maybe the debt wasn't a punishment. It was a responsibility. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. If the curse had fractured, spreading its burden across the world, then it was up to him to ensure that no one else suffered because of it. To track down those fragments, those echoes of the past, and contain them before they caused harm. But how? The journal provided few answers. its pages filled with cryptic references to locations and rituals that hinted at something larger, older than even the Maddox family curse. Yet hidden among the entries was a single phrase repeated multiple times, always accompanied by dates decades apart. "Find the keeper." At first, Daniel dismissed it as nonsense, a desperate plea from a woman losing her grip on reality. But the more he read, the clearer it became. The keeper wasn't a person. It was a role, a title bestowed upon someone tasked with maintaining balance between worlds, someone who could guide him, to help him understand what needed to be done. And, so armed with nothing but the journal, the shard of obsidian, and a growing sense of purpose, Daniel set out once again. His journey took him farther than he'd anticipated, deeper into forgotten places than any map dared to chart. Abandoned, towns swallowed by forests, churches buried beneath layers of ivy, caves etched with symbols older than language itself. Each location carried traces of the curse, echoes of pain and suffering left behind by those who had inherited fragments of the debt. But none held the answers he sought, until finally he found himself standing before a cabin nestled deep within the woods. Its walls were warped by time and neglect, its roof sagging under the weight of secrets long buried. Yet something about it felt familiar, as though he'd been here before, in another life. Inside, seated at a small wooden table, was an old man. His face was lined with age, his eyes clouded with cataracts, yet there was something piercing about his gaze, as though he could see straight through Daniel to the truth beneath. "You've come far," the man said softly, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "But you're not ready." "I don't have a choice," Daniel replied, his tone firm despite the storm raging inside him. "If I don't stop this, others will suffer because of my failure." The man nodded slowly, gesturing for Daniel to sit. "Then listen carefully," he said, leaning forward. "The debt isn't a curse, it's a balance, a reminder that every action has consequences. You can't destroy it, but you can manage it. Carry it forward, teach others to do the same, and perhaps someday—" He trailed off, his expression unreadable. "Someday what?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking under the strain. "Someday, the debt will find peace." When Daniel left the cabin hours later, the shard of obsidian rested securely in his pocket, its surface smooth and unbroken. The words etched into it had faded, replaced by a faint glow that pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. The old man's parting words echoed in his mind. "You are the keeper now." As he walked away, disappearing into the trees, Daniel realized something important. The curse hadn't ended. It had merely changed. Instead of being a victim, he was now its guardian, tasked with ensuring that no one else suffered because of it. And while the weight of that responsibility would always linger, haunting him like a shadow cast by an unyielding sun, it also gave him purpose. For the first time since inheriting the Maddox estate, Daniel felt whole. But as he stepped onto the road leading back to civilization, he noticed something strange. Reflected faintly in the glass of a nearby window were two figures standing where no one should have been. Children, their faces pale, their eyes wide with sorrow. And this time, they weren't pointing at something unseen. They were pointing at him. The end